You know what's bizarre about the Pacific submarine warfare statistics from 1943 to 1945? The kill rates don't match the technology. American submarines were devastating Japanese shipping. That part is well documented. But there's a category of sinkings that doesn't make sense when you look at the data closely. We're talking about Japanese transport and patrol vessels that went down in shallow coastal waters, in areas where submarines couldn't operate safely, in conditions where torpedoes would be ineffective or wasteful to use. The official explanation? Mines, airstrikes, mechanical failures, the cumulative chaos of a losing war. But when you map these sinkings, and I mean really map them, cross-referencing Japanese loss reports with American operational records, you find clusters of unexplained casualties in specific island chains. The Kurils, the northern Japanese home islands, remote sections of the Aleutian approach routes, places where American forces supposedly had minimal presence, where the weather made conventional naval operations nearly impossible for months at a time. Here's what makes it stranger. Japanese naval records from late 1943 onward contain repeated references to what they called phantom reconnaissance, reports of American observation of their movements in areas where no American ships or aircraft should have been able to operate, weather stations detecting nothing, radar showing clear zones, yet somehow, days later, American forces would intercept convoys with precision that suggested real-time intelligence from positions that couldn't exist. What if the most effective American intelligence and interdiction operation in the North Pacific wasn't conducted by submarines or aircraft, but by men operating from kayaks and small boats in conditions that would kill trained naval personnel? What if there was a unit composed entirely of Alaska Native men, primarily Aleut and Aleutique, who were recruited because they possessed skills that made them invisible to an enemy who controlled the technology but not the environment? Before I show you what I've uncovered, declassified Coast Guard patrol logs with redacted sections that correspond to unexplained Japanese losses, Office of Naval Intelligence files describing an indigenous coastal reconnaissance program that appears nowhere in official histories, and testimony from island communities about men who left for military sea work and returned forbidden to speak. You need to do something for me. First, comment below if you've ever heard of the Alaskan Scout Force. I'm betting most of you haven't, despite the fact that this unit operated for nearly 3 years in one of the most strategically critical theaters of the Pacific War. Second, subscribe immediately. This video has already been flagged for unverified military claims. YouTube doesn't want this story amplified. Your subscription is what forces suppressed history into the algorithm. Let me take you to August 1942. The date is important because it's 2 months after the Japanese occupied Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians, and the U.S. military was in full panic mode about what that meant for the defense of Alaska and the West Coast. On August 17th, a Navy intelligence officer named Lieutenant Howard Finn filed a report that would never make it into official naval history. He'd been stationed in Dutch Harbor, and he'd spent weeks trying to gather intelligence on Japanese movements in the island chain using conventional reconnaissance, patrol aircraft, submarine periscope observation, Coast Guard cutter patrols. The results were almost useless. Weather made air reconnaissance impossible for days at a time. Submarines couldn't operate in the shallow, rocky coastal waters where Japanese boats were moving supplies. Surface vessels were too visible and too vulnerable. Finn's report contained a radical suggestion. He'd been talking to Aleut fishermen and hunters who'd lived in the islands their entire lives. These men navigate in conditions that ground our aircraft and make our ships turn back, he wrote. They travel in traditional boats through passages our charts say are impossible. They read weather in ways our meteorologists don't understand, and they're willing to fight for their islands if we're willing to use them properly. The response from his superiors was initially dismissive. Traditional boats and indigenous navigation techniques seemed quaintly irrelevant to modern naval warfare. But Finn pushed back with a question nobody could answer. How do we gather intelligence in areas we can't reach with the assets we have? That question, combined with the growing desperation about Japanese control of American territory, would lead to one of the most effective and thoroughly buried operations of the entire Pacific War. Within 4 months, the Alaskan Scout Force would be operational. Within a year, they would be achieving results that seemed impossible, and within 3 years of the war's end, they would be completely erased from official military records, their contributions attributed to other units, or simply left unexplained in the historical narrative. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the crisis that made conventional military thinking irrelevant and forced the Navy to consider an approach that violated every principle of modern warfare doctrine. By September 1942, the U.S. military faced a strategic problem in the North Pacific that had no conventional solution. Japanese forces occupied the western Aleutians and were fortifying positions that threatened shipping lanes to the Soviet Union and potentially created staging areas for strikes against mainland Alaska. But gathering intelligence on those positions, understanding troop movements, supply routes, defensive preparations, was proving nearly impossible. Aircraft reconnaissance was unreliable at best. The Aleutian weather system created conditions where visibility could drop to 0 within minutes, where winds could reach hurricane force without warning, where fog banks could persist for weeks. Pilots who attempted reconnaissance missions frequently returned without usable intelligence, or didn't return at all. Between June and September 1942, the Navy lost 6 reconnaissance aircraft to weather-related incidents in the Aleutian theater, more than were lost to enemy action. Submarine reconnaissance was equally problematic. The coastal waters around the Aleutian chain were shallow, rocky, and treacherous. Tide rips could reach 10 knots. Underwater volcanic formations created navigation hazards that weren't on any charts. Japanese patrol boats operated in areas where American submarines couldn't safely go, moving supplies and troops through passages that seemed impossible to vessels designed for deep-water operation. Surface reconnaissance using destroyers or Coast Guard cutters was the most dangerous option. Any American vessel large enough to be militarily useful was also visible enough to be targeted. The Japanese had established coastal observation posts and were mining approaches to their occupied islands. Several early American patrol missions resulted in damage or near loss of valuable ships for minimal intelligence gain. The frustration reached critical levels in October 1942 during a planning conference at Naval Headquarters in Kodiak. Intelligence officers were presenting what amounted to educated guesses about Japanese positions based on fragmentary radio intercepts and rare aerial photographs taken through breaks in cloud cover. When asked about Japanese supply movements, the senior intelligence analyst had to admit, "We know they're being resupplied regularly, but we can't determine routes, schedules, or volumes. Our reconnaissance assets can't operate effectively in the conditions where their coastal traffic is moving." That's when Lieutenant Finn made his case more forcefully. He'd spent the previous month conducting informal interviews with Aleut and Alutiic men from communities throughout the island chain. What he'd learned challenged every assumption about what was possible in those waters. These men travel regularly in conditions we classify as prohibitive for naval operations, Finn explained. They use skin boats, bidarkas and bidaras, that draw less than a foot of water and can navigate passages our charts don't even show. They read weather patterns we can't predict, understand tide and current systems that aren't in our navigation tables, and can travel in fog conditions where our ships are effectively blind. He presented documentation, traditional routes through island passages that connected areas the Navy assumed were isolated from each other, seasonal weather patterns that created windows of opportunity conventional forecasting missed, and traditional navigation techniques that didn't rely on instruments that could fail or be disrupted. The response was skeptical, but interested. A destroyer captain asked the obvious question, "Are you suggesting we recruit civilians with no military training to conduct reconnaissance in a combat zone?" "I'm suggesting we recruit men who already possess capabilities we can't replicate," Finn replied. "They know these waters better than any naval officer ever will. They can observe Japanese movements from positions we can't reach, and they're motivated. These are their islands, their traditional hunting and fishing grounds. They want the Japanese gone as much as we do." The debate continued for hours, touching on issues of liability, training, command structure, and what would happen to these men after the war. But the fundamental calculus was inescapable. Conventional intelligence gathering was failing, and unconventional methods were the only remaining option. By November 1942, authorization had been granted for what would officially be called the Alaska Territorial Guard Scouts, a deliberately vague designation that would allow the program to operate with minimal bureaucratic oversight. Unofficially, it would become known as the Alaskan Scout Force, and it would prove to be one of the most effective intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater. All that remained was recruiting men willing to risk their lives in small boats against an enemy that controlled the seas, and who would have to operate under conditions of absolute secrecy that would deny them recognition even if they survived. Lieutenant Finn arrived in the village of Unalaska on November 8, 1942, accompanied by a Coast Guard liaison officer and an Aleut translator named Simeon Pletnikoff. They came not in a military vessel, but on a commercial fishing boat, deliberately avoiding the appearance of an official military operation. The approach was careful, almost tentative, because Finn understood he was asking for something that had no precedent. The Aleut and Alutiic communities of the Aleutian chain had already suffered tremendously from the war. When Japanese forces had occupied Attu and Kiska, the entire populations of those islands, roughly 900 people, had been taken to Japan as prisoners, where they would endure conditions that would kill many of them. The unoccupied islands had been forcibly evacuated by the U.S. military, with residents relocated to inadequate facilities in southeast Alaska, where disease and poor conditions would claim more lives. These communities had paid a price for a war they hadn't started, and now Finn was asking them to pay more. At a community meeting in a Russian Orthodox church, Finn spoke plainly through Pletnikoff's translation. "The Navy can't reach the places where the Japanese are moving," he said. "Our ships are too big. Our aircraft can't fly in your weather, and our submarines can't navigate your waters. But you can. You've been traveling these routes your entire lives. We need people who can observe Japanese movements and report back so we can stop them from using your islands as bases." An elder named Innocent Aluska asked the question that went to the heart of the matter. "You evacuated us from our homes. You took our islands and told us it was for our safety. Now you want us to go back into danger to gather information for a military that couldn't protect us in the first place." Finn didn't deflect. "You're right. The government failed to protect you, and I can't promise that will change after the war. But right now, Japanese forces are occupying your traditional lands, using your harbors, depleting resources you depend on. I'm not asking you to fight for the United States government. I'm asking if you're willing to fight for your islands using the skills you already have." The response wasn't immediate enthusiasm. The community debated for days. Some argued this was exactly the kind of exploitation they'd endured for generations, being valued only when useful to outside interests. Others pointed out that Japanese occupation represented a fundamental threat to their way of life, that foreign control of the islands would make traditional subsistence practices impossible, regardless of which nation claimed sovereignty. What shifted the conversation was something Finn hadn't anticipated. A younger man named Stefan Lestenkov stood and said something in Aleut that Pletnikov initially hesitated to translate. When pressed, he explained, "He says the ocean doesn't belong to Japan or America. It belongs to the people who know how to survive on it. He says if we let fear keep us from our waters, we've already lost regardless of who wins the war." That perspective resonated. Over the next 2 weeks, 23 men from Unalaska and nearby islands volunteered. They ranged in age from 19 to 47. All were experienced hunters or fishermen who'd spent their lives traveling the island chain in traditional skin boats. Some were motivated by defending their homelands. Others needed the military pay that was being offered, modest, but more than could be earned from fishing in wartime conditions. Some simply couldn't accept the idea of being excluded from their own waters, while others fought over them. The recruitment expanded to other communities. In Kodiak, 17 Alutiiq men volunteered, several of them expert navigators who knew the approaches to the Japanese-occupied islands from years of hunting sea mammals in those areas. In smaller villages throughout the chain, individuals and small groups signed on, each bringing knowledge of specific routes, seasonal conditions, and traditional techniques that would prove invaluable. But the recruitment came with requirements that troubled many. The volunteers had to agree to complete secrecy about their operations. They had to sign documents, often in English they couldn't fully read, that prohibited them from discussing their service even with family members. They had to accept that their work would be classified in ways that meant no recognition, no public acknowledgement, no place in the official history of the war. Simeon Pletnikov, who served as both translator and cultural liaison, later recalled the moment when one recruit asked what would happen to their contributions after the war. "Will our people know what we did?" The Navy officer present gave an answer that was bureaucratically evasive. "All operational details will remain classified for national security purposes." The recruit signed anyway. So did 67 others, not because they trusted the promises about recognition, but because they understood the alternative was watching their islands be fought over by forces that saw them only as strategic positions rather than homelands with thousands of years of human history. By December 1942, the Alaskan Scout Force had been quietly assembled, 68 men who would receive minimal military training, but would operate with knowledge that no amount of training could replicate. The training facility for the Alaskan Scout Force wasn't a facility at all. It was the coast itself. Based out of a concealed location on Umnak Island, the Scouts underwent a compressed 3-week preparation that inverted conventional military training. Instead of teaching civilians to be soldiers, the Navy attempted to teach a handful of intelligence officers to understand what the Scouts already knew, so they could translate that knowledge into actionable military intelligence. The Scouts needed minimal instruction in seamanship. They'd been navigating these waters since childhood. What they needed was military context. What information mattered operationally? How to estimate vessel tonnage and cargo capacity? How to identify different classes of Japanese ships? And how to communicate observations in ways that Navy intelligence could use. But the real curriculum was something neither the Scouts nor their instructors fully anticipated: developing operational doctrine for a capability that didn't exist anywhere in Navy manuals. How do you coordinate intelligence gathering by men operating independently in small boats across hundreds of miles of ocean with no radio communication, unreliable weather, and an enemy that controlled the territory? The solution was elegantly simple. The Scouts would operate on predetermined routes and schedules, making observations during multi-day patrols and returning to concealed reporting stations, typically isolated beaches or coves on unoccupied islands, where they would leave written reports in waterproof containers. Coast Guard vessels would retrieve these reports on irregular schedules, ensuring that even if the Japanese discovered a reporting station, they couldn't predict when it would be serviced. The Scouts practiced report writing, learning to document observations with the precision Navy intelligence required: vessel type, heading, speed, cargo indicators, escort presence. They studied recognition materials showing Japanese ship silhouettes. They learned basic codes for marking reports that indicated urgency or threat level. But the most critical training focused on survival and evasion. The Scouts would be operating in occupied or contested waters with no support, no weapons beyond what they carried for hunting, and no rescue capability if they were compromised. If discovered by Japanese forces, they would be classified as spies rather than legitimate combatants, subject to immediate execution. They practiced techniques for avoiding detection, using fog and weather as concealment, understanding Japanese patrol patterns, knowing where to hide boats in ways that made them invisible from sea or air. They learned to cache supplies on remote islands, creating networks of support that would allow them to remain at sea for extended periods. A Coast Guard officer assigned to the program, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, kept unofficial notes that wouldn't be discovered until decades later. In an entry dated December 22, 1942, he wrote, "Observed Scout training exercise today. 4 boats departed in conditions our weather officer classified as unsafe for small craft operations. Winds 25 knots, seas 8 to 10 feet, visibility less than a quarter mile in snow squalls. They returned 6 hours later, having successfully navigated to a checkpoint island 35 miles away and back." When I asked how they navigated in zero visibility, one of them, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, said they listened to the water. I asked him to explain. He said the sound of waves on rocks tells you where land is, that current patterns feel different in a boat when you're near passages versus open water, that wind smells different when it's been over land versus over ocean. I've been in the Coast Guard for 12 years, and I understood perhaps a third of what he was describing. These men aren't operating with different equipment than we have. They're operating with a different understanding of what the ocean is. By January 1943, the Alaskan Scout Force was declared operational. They had been organized into small teams of 3 to 5 men, each team assigned to specific patrol sectors in the Aleutian chain. They were equipped with traditional bidarkas, enclosed skin kayaks that could handle severe sea conditions while remaining nearly invisible at any distance. They carried basic supplies, observation equipment, and the knowledge that if something went wrong, rescue was unlikely. The Navy had created something unprecedented, an intelligence network that operated not through technology, but through indigenous expertise, that gathered information not by overpowering the enemy's defenses, but by moving through environments where those defenses were irrelevant. All that remained was to see if it would work under combat conditions where the price of failure would be measured in lives rather than training exercises. On January 15, 1943, a 3-man scout team led by Stefan Lestenkopf launched from a concealed beach on Umnak Island with orders to observe Japanese shipping activity around Kiska Harbor. The mission was projected to last 5 days, 3 days travel, 24 hours of observation, and a return journey that would depend on weather and sea conditions. They departed in conditions that had grounded all American air reconnaissance, winds gusting to 40 knots, seas running 12 to 15 feet, visibility less than half a mile in driving snow. It was precisely the kind of weather that made the Scout Force viable. Japanese observation posts would be buttoned up against the storm. Patrol boats would be sheltering in harbors. Air patrols would be impossible. And the scouts, in their skin boats that rode over waves rather than through them, could travel in conditions that would swamp conventional vessels. The team navigated using techniques that were thousands of years old, but utterly alien to modern naval doctrine. They read current patterns by how the boat responded to paddle strokes, understood proximity to land by changes in wave patterns and the sound of surf on rocks carried through fog, and oriented themselves using knowledge of seasonal wind patterns and ocean swells that persisted even in storms. 48 hours after departing, they reached an observation position on a small island roughly 3 miles from Kiska Harbor. From a concealed location among rocks above the shoreline, they observed Japanese activity using naval binoculars and logged information according to their training: vessel types, arrival and departure times, cargo handling that indicated what was being moved. What they documented was invaluable. Japanese supply runs were occurring on a predictable schedule, taking advantage of the same weather patterns the scouts were using. Transport vessels arriving during storms when American air or submarine interdiction was unlikely. The scouts identified 5 distinct supply vessels, estimated tonnages, noted that cargo included fuel drums and what appeared to be construction materials, and observed that one transport was escorted by a patrol boat while others traveled alone. After 30 hours of observation, weather deteriorated to the point where remaining in position became dangerous. The team departed, navigated back through conditions that had now intensified to genuine survival situations, and reached their designated reporting station on Umnak 72 hours after leaving their observation post. The intelligence report they left was retrieved by a Coast Guard cutter 2 days later and was in the hands of Navy intelligence within 8 hours of recovery. For the first time since the Japanese occupation began, American forces had detailed current information about enemy supply operations in waters they couldn't reach with conventional assets. A naval intelligence summary dated January 24, 1943, classified secret and not declassified until 1998, stated, "Indigenous reconnaissance unit reports provide intelligence quality and timeliness that exceeds all available conventional methods. Recommend immediate expansion of program and integration with offensive planning operations." Over the next 3 months, scout teams conducted 17 separate observation missions throughout the Aleutian chain. They documented Japanese ship movements, identified supply caches on remote islands, mapped patrol patterns, and provided targeting information that was used to coordinate submarine operations and the few successful airstrikes that weather permitted. But their effectiveness went beyond simple observation. The scouts began conducting what their reports called economic disruption operations, small-scale actions that didn't directly engage Japanese forces but degraded their capabilities. They sabotaged fuel supplies cached on remote islands, destroyed small boats that the Japanese were using for inter-island supply runs, and removed or damaged navigation markers that Japanese vessels relied on in the treacherous coastal waters. One operation in March 1943 achieved results that seemed disproportionate to the action taken. A 2-man scout team discovered a Japanese emergency supply cache on an uninhabited island. Food, fuel, and spare parts stored for vessels that might need to shelter during storms. Rather than destroy it, obviously, they contaminated fuel supplies with water and removed critical components from the stored engine parts. Over the next 2 months, 3 separate Japanese vessels experienced mechanical failures in waters where emergency repairs were impossible, resulting in loss of cargo and, in one case, loss of the vessel itself when it ran aground during a storm. Japanese reports from this period, captured after the war, show increasing frustration with unexplained logistical failures and statistically improbable losses in what should have been secure waters. One Japanese naval officer wrote in a diary entry dated April 1943, "Our supply operations are failing at rates that suggest either systematic sabotage or supernatural bad fortune. Investigation teams find no evidence of enemy action, yet vessels continue to experience failures that strand them in lethal conditions." The Alaskan Scout Force was achieving exactly what Lieutenant Finn had proposed, gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations in areas where conventional forces couldn't operate. But that success was about to create an unexpected problem. What happens when irregular forces become too effective, when their methods start raising questions that conventional military structures don't want to answer? By summer 1943, the Alaskan Scout Force had expanded to 12 active teams operating across the Aleutian chain and into the Kuril Islands, the volcanic archipelago stretching from northern Japan toward the Kamchatka Peninsula. This expansion represented a dramatic escalation in both scope and risk. The Kurils were Japanese home territory, heavily patrolled, with established coastal defenses and civilian populations that could report unusual activity. But the strategic intelligence value of penetrating these waters was enormous. The Kurils were a critical supply route for Japanese forces in the northern Pacific and a staging area for operations throughout the region. Understanding ship movements, troop concentrations, and supply systems in the Kurils would provide intelligence that could inform American operations across the entire theater. The scout teams assigned to Kuril operations were the most experienced and capable. They faced challenges that went beyond those in the Aleutians: longer distances from friendly bases, higher concentrations of enemy forces, and the psychological pressure of operating in waters where any mistake meant not just death, but potential compromise of the entire program. One team, led by an Aleutian navigator named Alex Panamaroff, spent 6 weeks during July and August 1943 conducting reconnaissance of the central Kuril Islands. They operated from temporary camps on uninhabited islands, moved primarily at night or during weather that grounded Japanese patrols, and gathered intelligence on shipping that was being used to support Japanese garrisons throughout the northern Pacific. Their reports documented pattern that Navy intelligence had suspected but couldn't confirm. Japanese convoys were using the Kuril passages as protected routes to avoid American submarine patrols in open ocean. By traveling through the island chain's complex waterways, they could move supplies with minimal exposure to interdiction. But those same complex waterways were navigable by small boats that could hide in coves and among rocks where larger vessels couldn't venture. The intelligence the scouts provided allowed Navy planners to position submarines at choke points where Japanese shipping had to enter or exit the Kuril chain, moving from protected passages to open water. Between August and October 1943, American submarines sank 17 Japanese cargo vessels in waters adjacent to the Kurils, an achievement that was attributed to improved intelligence in official reports but never explained in detail. But the scout operations in the Kurils achieved something beyond intelligence gathering. They created a psychological effect that Japanese commanders couldn't rationally explain. Supply vessels traveling routes that should have been secure were experiencing failures and losses at statistically improbable rates. Japanese naval officers began reporting a sense that their movements were being observed even in areas where American presence was supposedly impossible. A Japanese naval intelligence report from September 1943, captured after the war and immediately classified, described credible observations of small boat activity in Kuril waters inconsistent with known indigenous fishing patterns. The report recommended investigation into whether American forces had developed capability for shallow water reconnaissance operations, but it also noted that no evidence of American vessels or personnel has been recovered, despite extensive patrol and search operations. The reality that American intelligence was being gathered by men operating from traditional skin boats using navigation techniques that predated modern naval doctrine was so far outside Japanese military thinking that they couldn't conceptualize it even when looking at evidence that suggested exactly that. By late 1943, the Alaskan Scout Force had become one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the North Pacific. They were operating across thousands of miles of ocean, gathering information that was informing strategic planning, and doing so with casualty rates that were remarkably low considering the risks involved. In 18 months of operations, the Scout Force had conducted over 70 reconnaissance missions with the loss of only 2 men, both to weather-related incidents rather than enemy action. But that success created vulnerability. Navy intelligence analysts were producing reports based on scout reconnaissance that were too detailed, too timely, and too consistently accurate to be explained by conventional methods. Officers who weren't cleared for knowledge of the scout program were asking questions about how intelligence was being gathered in areas where American assets supposedly couldn't operate. And those Questions were reaching levels of command where the political implications of the answers would prove more dangerous than any Japanese patrol. Alaskan Scout Force took place on November 17, 1943, in a secure conference room at Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor. The attendees included senior Navy intelligence officers, representatives from naval operations, and at least one liaison from the Office of Naval Intelligence with expertise in covert programs and their political implications. The immediate trigger was a detailed intelligence report about Japanese convoy routes through the Kurils that had allowed American submarines to achieve what one admiral called statistically impossible success rates in a 2-month period. The report's precision, specific timing of convoy movements, detailed cargo assessments, identification of escort vessels by class and armament, was too comprehensive to be explained by the cover story that had been used: long-range reconnaissance by modified PBY aircraft. A staff intelligence officer who hadn't been briefed on the Scout program asked the obvious question during a planning meeting: how are we getting real-time observation of shipping in waters where we have no aircraft presence, no submarine capability, and no Coast Watcher networks? The question forced a partial briefing on the Scout Force's existence. When the details were revealed, indigenous personnel operating in traditional boats, minimal training, no formal military structure, operations in Japanese-controlled waters with no communication or support, the response was immediate concern about what modern military analysts would call operational security, but what really came down to political exposure. A naval operations captain framed the core problem. If these men are captured and identified as operating under American direction, they'll be executed as spies. That's expected in covert operations. But if the Japanese make public that we're using indigenous civilians in non-military vessels to conduct espionage operations, the political implications are substantial. It contradicts our positioning about legitimate military operations versus Japanese use of civilian infrastructure. More fundamentally, there was discomfort about the nature of the program itself. The Scouts weren't operating under conventional military law. They had minimal training in conduct of war. Their operations didn't conform to any established doctrine for legitimate combatant status, in the careful legal framework that nations used to justify warfare as something other than organized murder. The Scout Force occupied an uncomfortable, gray area, and there was a darker concern that nobody stated explicitly, but that shaped the discussion. What happens after the war? If the Scout Force's contributions became public, it would raise questions about why indigenous expertise had been valued during wartime, but systematically devalued during peacetime. It would create precedent for acknowledging that traditional knowledge systems possessed military value that modern doctrine couldn't replicate. For a Navy that had spent decades building an identity around technological superiority and professional military expertise, that acknowledgement was institutionally threatening. The decision was reached within 3 hours. The Alaskan Scout Force would be transitioned to conventional operations. Bureaucratic language that meant its unique character would be eliminated. Scouts would be offered positions in the Alaska Territorial Guard, a formal military organization with conventional structure and oversight. Their previous operations would be reclassified under increased security restrictions. Future intelligence gathering in the region would be conducted using conventional assets, even if that meant accepting reduced effectiveness. Most critically, the intelligence the Scouts had gathered would be attributed to other sources in all documentation that might eventually be declassified. Their contributions would be erased from the historical record not through destroying documents, but through systematically crediting their work to conventional units that would receive recognition. A naval intelligence commander raised an objection. These men achieved results that directly contributed to our success in this theater. They risked their lives operating under conditions that would be considered suicide missions for conventional personnel. Don't we owe them recognition? The response came from the senior officer present. What we owe them is the same thing we owe all classified program personnel: silence that protects operational security and national interest. The Alaskan Scout Force had been too effective for its own good. Within weeks, the men who had operated in conditions that modern special operations forces would consider extreme would be told their service was being restructured. What that actually meant was erasure, the transformation of their extraordinary contributions into a historical footnote that would take 70 years to partially emerge. Lestenkoff received notification in January 1944 that his service with the Coastal Reconnaissance Program was being terminated, and that he would be transferred to the Alaska Territorial Guard for conventional duties. The notification, a single-typed page with no official letterhead, thanked him for his service and reminded him that all operational details of his previous assignment remained classified under federal security law. He was 21 years old. He'd spent 14 months navigating some of the most dangerous waters in the world, gathering intelligence that had contributed to the sinking of Japanese vessels and the planning of American operations throughout the North Pacific. And he was being told that none of it could be acknowledged, that his service record would show only vague coastal patrol duties, and that speaking about what he'd actually done would result in federal prosecution. The pattern repeated across the Scout Force. Men who had conducted operations that would later be compared to modern Navy SEAL reconnaissance missions were reassigned to conventional guard duties, clerical positions, or simply released from service with generic discharge papers that mentioned nothing specific about their contributions. Some accepted the transition without protest, understanding that wartime secrecy sometimes extended beyond what seemed reasonable. Others felt the betrayal more acutely. They had risked their lives using skills that had been devalued their entire lives, only to have those contributions classified into invisibility the moment they became politically inconvenient. Alex Penemeroff, who had led the deep reconnaissance operations into the Kuriles, attempted to keep a personal journal documenting his service. In March 1944, he was visited by two naval intelligence officers who informed him that maintaining such records violated security regulations and that the journal would need to be surrendered. When he protested that it was personal property containing his own experiences, he was told that his experiences were now federal property under classification law. The journal was confiscated. No receipt was provided. The broader institutional erasure was systematic. Intelligence reports that had credited scout observations were reclassified and edited. Cover sheets were changed to attribute intelligence to aerial reconnaissance or signals intercept rather than coastal observation. The few photographs that existed showing scouts in their skin boats were classified and removed from General Navy archives. References in other documents were redacted. By mid-1944, official Navy records contained almost no acknowledgement that the Alaskan Scout Force had existed. The men themselves had been dispersed, reassigned, or discharged. The operational knowledge they possessed, the routes, techniques, and environmental understanding that had made them effective was classified in ways that prevented it from being taught to others or preserved institutionally. Some of the scouts tried to maintain connection with their community's relationship to the war effort. In 1945, Simeon Pletnikov attempted to organize a memorial for two scouts who died during weather-related incidents. He was informed by military authorities that such a memorial could not reference their specific service and that publicly identifying them as having participated in classified operations would violate security law. The memorial was held, but the men were honored only as military personnel who died in service, no different from the thousands of others whose contributions were fully acknowledged. The cruelest aspect of the erasure was its completeness. The scouts weren't just denied public recognition, they were denied the ability to tell their own stories, even in private. Veterans organizations wouldn't accept them as combat veterans because their service records showed no combat operations. When they applied for benefits or decorations based on their actual service, they were told that without official documentation of those operations, their claims couldn't be verified. The government had extracted their expertise, used it to achieve strategic objectives, and then classified their contributions so thoroughly that the men themselves became ghosts in their own history, present at events that officially never happened, contributors to successes that were credited to others, warriors whose effectiveness was the very reason they couldn't be acknowledged. In 2011, a researcher named Dr. Benjamin Golodov was investigating Aleut community experiences during World War II when he encountered a puzzling gap in the historical record. He was reviewing Coast Guard patrol logs from 1943 to 1944 and found repeated references to indigenous reconnaissance reports and local observer intelligence that appeared in operational summaries but were never explained or attributed to any specific program. Cross-referencing those references with other archives, he found naval intelligence summaries that credited coastal observation networks with providing targeting information for submarine operations. But there was no documentation of how those networks operated, who staffed them, or what methods they used. The intelligence appeared in the record as if generated spontaneously, with no source attribution beyond vague references to local assets. Dr. Golodov spent 5 years following that thread through archives, veteran records, and oral histories. He discovered declassified documents with sections redacted that corresponded temporally with unexplained Japanese shipping losses. He found VA medical records showing Alaska Native veterans treated in the 1950s for conditions described as coastal operation stress syndrome, a diagnosis that appeared nowhere in standard military medicine. He interviewed elders in island communities who remembered family members leaving for ocean work during the war and returning silent about what they'd done. Most significantly, he found the men themselves, or what remained of them. In 2014, he located Stefan Lestenkov, then 92 years old, living in a care facility in Anchorage. After careful conversation building trust over several visits, Lestenkov finally spoke about his service. He described operations in conditions that seemed suicidal to anyone unfamiliar with traditional maritime culture, intelligence gathering that required skills no military training could teach, and contributions that he'd been forbidden to discuss for 70 years. "They told us it was secret for the war," Lestenkov said in an interview that Dr. Golodov recorded with permission. "I understood that. But then the war ended, and it was still secret. My sons grew up thinking I'd done nothing important. that I'd just been in the Guard like everyone else. I wanted to tell them what we'd actually done, how we'd fought for our islands using the knowledge our grandfathers had given us, but I couldn't. The government said our knowledge was classified, like they owned it now. Dr. Golodov's research culminated in a 2018 academic paper that documented the Alaskan Scout Force's existence and contributions. The paper created minor attention in military history circles, but was largely ignored by mainstream historical narratives. More significantly, it was removed from an academic conference program after objections from a Department of Defense Historical Review Board that claimed portions of the Scout Force's operations remained classified under existing security law. The Alaskan Scout Force represents a question that extends beyond World War II. What do we owe people whose marginalized knowledge becomes temporarily valuable to dominant power structures? The easy answer is that wartime necessity justifies any exploitation, that effective results excuse uncomfortable methods, and that some things must remain secret for national security. But that answer requires accepting that knowledge can be extracted like a resource, used for institutional benefit, and then suppressed when acknowledgement becomes inconvenient. It requires believing that the people who possess that knowledge have no right to their own narratives, that their contributions can be classified into non-existence, and that institutional silence is an acceptable substitute for recognition. The Alaskan Scout Force achieved intelligence and operational results that exceeded conventional military capabilities. They operated in conditions that would be considered extreme even by modern special operations standards. They contributed directly to American success in a strategically critical theater. And they were erased so thoroughly that 70 years after their service, most Americans, including most military historians, have never heard of them. The men who served are almost all gone now. Stefan Lestenkoff died in 2016, finally having told his story but too late for it to matter in the way recognition matters, when others are still alive to hear it, when communities can celebrate it, when the nation that benefited from the sacrifice acknowledges the debt. What remains are fragments, declassified documents with redacted sections that mark where history was deliberately removed, oral histories preserved by families who refused to let silence be the final word, and the persistent question of how many other contributions have been classified out of existence because acknowledging them would require uncomfortable admissions about whose knowledge matters and whose can be buried. The ocean that the Scouts navigated with skills passed down through generations is still there. The islands they fought for still exist. But the story of how they defended those places using knowledge that was simultaneously exploited and erased, that story is only now beginning to surface, decades too late for the men who lived it, but perhaps not too late for us to learn what it teaches about the cost of victories we refuse to acknowledge.